Hello, I'm Sensei Alex Kakuya. The title of today's talk is The Truth About Women's Enlightenment. Before we get into that, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. That way you'll be notified when I post talks in the future. If you wouldn't mind hitting the like button, that'd be great too. Recently, the question of women's enlightenment and whether or not women can realize enlightenment came up on my Twitter feed. And I was going to reply on that platform, but the thread started to get kind of long, so I thought it'd be better to record a Dharma talk instead. Now, this may seem like an obvious question to some of us. However, there is a sutta out there that raises some questions. It's found in the Theravada tradition. It's called the Bahu Dhatuka Sutta, and I'll be reading from a translation from Bhikkhu Sujata. And the passage in question goes like this. They understand it's impossible for a woman to be a perfected one, a fully awakened Buddha. But it is possible for a man to be a perfected one, a fully awakened Buddha. They understand it's impossible for a woman to be a wheel-turning monarch, but it is possible for a man to be a wheel-turning monarch. They understand it's impossible for a woman to perform the role of Saka, Mara, or Brahma, but it is possible for a man to perform the role of Saka, Mara, or Brahma. Now, I'll post a link to the entire sutta in the description for this talk, so you can read it in its entirety. However, if someone were to read this passage in isolation, I can certainly understand why they might think that the Buddha is saying women cannot realize enlightenment. However, that's why it's so important to read all of the Buddhist scriptures, because it's only when we look at all of them together in context that passages like this one make sense. We know from other sutras like the Pratipana Sutra, the Lotus Sutra, the Vimalakirti Sutra, the Nirvana Sutra, that the Buddha either explicitly or implicitly states that women can in fact realize enlightenment, that their ability to do so is no different than that of a man. However, one might argue, well, those are only Mahayana Buddhist texts, and maybe the teaching is different in the Theravada. However, that's not true, because if we look at another Theravadan Buddhist text, in this case the Gautami Sutta, we find this passage where the Buddha's stepmother is attempting to enter the Buddhist order. The Buddha initially says no. I'll explain why he did that in a moment. But eventually he changes his mind after this exchange with Ananda, one of his disciples. Ananda says, "So he said to the Blessed One, Lord, if a woman were to go forth from the home life into homelessness, in the Dhamma and Vinaya made known by the Tathagata, would she be able to realize the fruit of stream entry, once returning, non-returning, or arhatship?" "Yes, Ananda, she would," was the Buddha's reply. Ananda then says, "In that case, Lord, Mahapajapati Gautami has been of great service to the Blessed One. She was the Blessed One's aunt, foster mother, nurse, giver of milk. When the Blessed One's mother passed away, she gave him milk. It would be good if women might obtain the going forth from the home life into homelessness in the Dhamma and Vinaya, made known by the Tathagata." The Buddha replied, "Ananda, if Mahapajapati Gautami accepts 8 rules of respect, that will be her acceptance as a nun." So, in this passage, the Buddha is saying explicitly that women are able to realize enlightenment, just like a man, if they practice the Dhamma and Vinaya, if they go forth into homelessness. So, with that being the case, we have to wonder, what was the Buddha saying in the Bahu Dhatuka Sutta, where he states, they understand it's impossible for a woman to be a perfected one, a fully awakened Buddha. And what we need to understand is that in this passage, Buddha is not speaking about enlightenment. He's actually speaking of more of a vocation or a job title. He's saying that it's impossible for a woman to be in charge of the Buddhist order, that there must always be a man at the head, and that the women must practice under him and under the male monastics. Now, that might sound a bit sexist, and it is. However, it does make sense in the context of the history that Buddha was living in. In ancient India, women were seen as property. When they were children and adolescents, they lived under the protection of their father and their brothers. After they were married, they lived under the protection of their husband and his brothers. So they had no autonomy, they had no agency of their own. So a woman going into homelessness, being a wanderer, a mendicant monk like the Buddha and his monastics, was in great, great danger. There were no police to protect them at that point. So without that male head, that male protection, they were putting themselves at risk, which is why the Buddha initially said that they could not join the Buddhist order. However, when he was asked, and he admitted that a woman's ability to realize enlightenment if she practiced the Dhamma and Vinaya was no different than that of a man, he did allow them to join the order, but under certain conditions. Essentially, he allowed them to join if they did so under the protection and the agency of the Buddha and the male monastics. So, for example, he makes the rule that if a woman practices for 100 years, she's still going to be subordinate to a male monastic, even if he's been practicing for less time, which, again, sounds sexist, and it is, but given the historical context, it makes sense. What he was essentially doing was turning him into the father and the male monastics into the brothers of the nuns of the Buddhist orders. So disrespecting one of them would be like disrespecting the Buddha. In the same way that if a woman was married, disrespecting her would be like disrespecting her husband. He was bringing them into an area of protection so that they would not be harmed in their wandering homeless life. So, was this a perfect solution? Probably not. However, I do again think it's understandable given the historical context, and I do think we can really put to bed the question of whether or not women can realize enlightenment. The Buddha said that they can as long as they practice diligently, which I've not read anything in the suttas or the sutras in the Mahayana or the Theravada tradition to suggest otherwise. Amitabha.